Next up is Robert Frost's Out Out. This is on page 680. And we've gone from, what was the last poem, 17 something or 18 something, now to 1916. So we've skipped at least 100 years. And these poems feel very different. They sound different. So we had a very established rhyme scheme in the first poem, The Tiger. We don't have that here in this poem by Robert Frost. Now, if you read the other poems by Frost in the packet for this week, he does have rhyme schemes. But I like this poem a lot. First, because it's narrative, and we'll get to that in a second, but also because it doesn't rely on the rhyme scheme. Because sometimes I think those are a little sing-songy, and I tend not to enjoy some of those poems quite as much. I mean, that can be something we discuss in the thread this week, is whether you prefer rhyme poetry or not, or does poetry have to be rhymed, and all those sorts of things. But I like this poem because it seems different than a lot of the Robert Frost that I'd read. And you probably have read and discussed Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening and The Road Not Taken, and all of the metaphorical things that those symbolize in your high school classes or when you were younger. And I don't want to say that they have easy morals that you can parse out of that, but I like this poem because it's a little bit grittier. It shows sort of the tougher side of life, and it doesn't have that sing-songy rhyme scheme. So this poem appealed to me for some of those reasons. Now, if we compare it to The Tiger was lyric, and here we have a narrative poem, right? Because there is a story being told. We have the boy who's working, the saw leaps out, gets his hand, and eventually what happens? He dies, right? So we have a story being told, and we have a character, and we have the boy. He's the main character, and also, maybe he's the protagonist, if we're using some of our fiction terms. And then the antagonist is the saw, right? There are a couple of points where the saw is personified. I'm thinking of lines. Where are they? If I can figure out what lines they are. Around 15. As at the word supper, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out of the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. So we're giving the saw qualities that a person would have, right? So that verb choice of leap makes the saw come alive, right? In a way that a saw really is not alive. It sort of gives it agency or thought or motivation, which really isn't the case. This is an accident, but the poem portrays that in a slightly different way. So again, when we talk about word choice, the use of the word leaped, all of a sudden that's giving us a figurative meaning, right? So it's no longer just a mechanical saw, but it's personifying the saw and making it a little bit human-like. And that's what a single word choice can do here and there. So we have a narrative poem, but it's telling a story, right? And we could talk about sounds within the poem. We don't have the same type of rhyme that we had in The Tiger, but we do have repetitions of sounds. In the first line, we have the buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard, and then a few lines later we have and the saw snarled and rattled. And in fact, I believe that, does it come back again? I can't remember. I'm scanning. I don't have it underlined if it does. But there are repetitions. Even though it's not like exact rhymes that we had in the other poem, there are these echoes of different sounds or even the repetition of whole words. If we look around line 4 and 5, no, actually, let's back up. Line 2 and 3. And made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. So there's this echo of sound in the second and third lines, dust and stuff. So these are like half rhymes. They don't appear at the end of the line, but they appear in the middle of the line. So we had one of those instances in The Tiger. So we have an interior rhyme, and it's not a full rhyme, it's a half rhyme, dust and stuff. A similar thing happens in lines 4 and 5. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges one behind the other. Eyes and 5. Not an exact rhyme or full rhyme, it's a half rhyme. Those are embedded in the lines. So even though we don't have a rhyme scheme where you can tick off at the end of each line A, B, C, D, those sorts of things, there is a use of sound in this poem that keeps us going. It's sort of like a locomotion throughout the poem. If we look at line 6, under the sunset far into Vermont. And I see 2 different sounds here being repeated. The un sound in under, which comes back in sunset, under, sun, sunset. And then the ER sound, under, and then into Vermont. So maybe you think these are accidents, but I think that maybe they are accidents, but maybe they're happy accidents. They do contribute something to the poem. So it's not like there's no focus on sound in this poem. Just the sound is working differently than you might have seen in the tiger. We talked a little bit about the personification. That's kind of a figurative thing. And let's talk about word choice again. If we consider the characters, we have the boy, and then we also have the saw. And so for a large part of the poem, the saw, that word SAW, is a noun, right? It's the actual mechanical saw. But around line 22 or 23, then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know. Big boy doing a man's work. Though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. And so we've gone from using the word SAW, saw, as a noun to using it as a verb. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that's a purposeful choice. They're supposed to mirror each other. And I think what's happening in the poem is the boy, because he's old enough to do this work, is sort of becoming a man, right? Is there a line about that? He's talking about he's old enough to do work. And then in these lines that I just said, since he was old enough to know. And so there's this idea that being able to do work makes you a man or makes you mature, but then it's also this idea of like knowing or being able to see. And so the saw becomes important in two ways. One, you have to, to sort of enter maturity, you have to be able to work the mechanical saw, but then you also have to be able to see. And so you have the past tense verb form of see, which is saw. And so saw is being used here in a couple of different ways. And you have to be able to use that in order to sort of to move from innocence into experience, right? And there isn't a lot of experience because the boy ends up dying in the poem, which is a little unfortunate. I also thought, and maybe this is something I'll leave open for you guys to talk about in discussion, but I think there is some gender stuff going on here. I'm thinking of the bottom of page 680. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know. Big boy doing a man's work. So we have boy, boy, man. Though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. Don't let him cut my hand off, the doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. So it seems like this boy is, aspiring to become a man. But who does he ask for help? He asks his sister. So I think that's kind of interesting, this little gender play that's going on in the poem. Do we have imagery in this poem? I think we do. I think we have the saw. And even, so when we think of images, we probably think of visual things first, but an image can also call out a sound. And so I would consider that the snarled and rattled, those descriptions, even though it appears to our ears, or appeals to our ears, I would call those images, right? Because it appeals to our senses. Really, an image is not just something that appeals to our visual sense, it appeals to anything else. So anything that would give you sort of elicit, it's hard to, you probably don't have a lot of taste images in a poem, but you will have a lot of sound images, sight, those sorts of things. So snarled and rattled I would consider an image. The life from the life spilling out, that word spilling, sort of gives me an image of that. He lay and puffed his lips out with breath, all of these sorts of things. So I do think that we have some good images here. This is a far more concrete poem than the tiger is, right? The tiger seemed a little bit ethereal and abstract. There's a real event. I mean, whether it actually happened or not, who knows? But there is an event that we can identify happening in the poem, right? So this is far more concrete than the tiger was. So a good way of comparing and contrasting a couple of poems. So we have the lyric tiger, the narrative poem here. The first one had an established rhyme scheme. This one doesn't have an established rhyme scheme, but it does use sound throughout the poem in order to accomplish a few goals. So those are just, if you're thinking about doing a compare and contrast paper maybe for the poetry unit, this is a way that you can start thinking about two poems in that kind of way.